The cold steel of a Colt .45 pressed against 12-year-old Leo Reed's temple, and in that moment, he knew he was going to die. The bank robbery had started like thunder from a clear sky. 3 masked men bursting through splintered glass, their guns gleaming like death itself in the afternoon light. Now Leo stood frozen as a human shield, the outlaw's calloused fingers wrapped around his throat, his pulse hammering against the killer's thumb. "Anyone moves, the boy gets it," the brute snarled behind his dark bandana. But this story doesn't end where you think it does. Because sometimes, in the most godforsaken places, mercy comes from the most unexpected hands. And sometimes, a single moment of kindness between strangers can change the course of 2 broken lives forever. Let me tell you about the day death looked Leo Reed in the eye and blinked first. The wind had come in off the plains that morning like a dry, forgotten song, whispering through the broken pickets of the porch. Leo sat on the top step, whittling a small bird from a piece of sun-bleached wood, the soft rasp of his blade against the grain, the only sound breaking the heavy silence. His father, a man made of grief and whiskey, was inside. The quiet was heavier than the dust on the floorboards, a silence Leo had learned to fill with his carving. Each delicate cut a small rebellion against the emptiness that had swallowed their home. His father hadn't spoken a real word since the fever took his mother 2 years back. Just grunts and the low, mournful sigh of a man drowning in his own memory. Leo finished the bird, its wings delicate and perfect. He placed it next to the row of others he had carved, each a silent witness to the passage of time. The sun was a low furnace, turning the sky a bruised purple, and the air was thick with the scent of sagebrush and regret. He needed to get into town for flour and cornmeal, using the last of the money from his father's sale of a small plot of land, money earmarked to pay off a creeping loan at the First Redemption Bank. The walk was long, but it was a quiet ritual. He wore his mother's old, worn-out hat, the brim soft and familiar against his forehead. The town of Redemption was a collection of buildings that looked like they had been spat out of the earth itself, all sharp angles and unpainted wood. The bank, a solid brick fortress in the heart of town, felt out of place, a monument to the fleeting idea of security in a world built on sand. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of polished wood and ink. Leo stood in line, a few dollars clutched in his hand, a small carved bird in his pocket. The teller, a kind man with a tired face, was counting out coins. Then came the sound. A splintering crash of glass, a sound so violent it seemed to suck the air from the room. 3 men, their faces hidden behind dark bandanas, burst in. The world shrank to the click of a hammer, the glint of a steel barrel. One of the robbers, a giant of a man with a wild look in his eyes, grabbed Leo from the line. He pressed that cold, heavy pistol against Leo's temple. "Anyone moves, the boy gets it," the brute snarled, his voice a low rumble. Leo's breath hitched. He couldn't move. He couldn't think. He was a doll, a shield, a piece of meat. He stared at the floorboards, a universe of splinters and dirt. The fear was a physical thing, a cold hand, squeezing his heart. A shot rang out, a sharp, clean sound. Not from the brute's gun, but a signal. The leader, a scarred man with eyes as hard as flint, barked orders. The 3rd man, younger and leaner, stood near the door, his rifle held loosely. Through the slits in his bandana, Leo saw his eyes. They were a pale, washed-out blue, a color that looked out of place on such a hard face. They were not hard. They were seeing. They met Leo's for a moment, and in that fleeting second, Leo saw a flicker of something he couldn't name. Not pity. Something else. Recognition. The sound of a shotgun blast from outside rattled the windows. The posse. The brute tightened his grip on Leo, the gun pressing harder. "We gotta go," he yelled, his voice laced with panic. He shoved Leo roughly toward the leader, who was stuffing money into a sack. But the young man, the one with the blue eyes, moved. It was a fluid motion, a subtle shift of weight. He pushed Leo aside, not with a shove, but with a firm, protective hand on his back. "Go," he whispered, his voice a low, raspy murmur. "Don't look back." Leo stumbled, his legs a mess of knots and tremors. He ran. He didn't look back. The sounds of shouts and gunfire faded behind him as he fled the town. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs ached, until the setting sun turned the plains into a sea of fire and shadow. He made it back to the cabin, collapsing on the porch steps. The world was still spinning, but his hand went to his chest, to the spot where the man had pushed him. He was alive. He was a witness. But more than that, he was a survivor, saved by the very hand of an outlaw. The town was a coiled spring. The sheriff's posse rode out at dawn, their faces grim, their rifles glinting in the morning light. The general store was abuzz with whispers, theories, and bitter recriminations. The robbers were still out there. They had a name whispered in hushed tones, the Thorne Gang. And the youngest one, they said, was the most ruthless of all. Leo sat on the porch, his father inside in his whiskey-soaked silence. The bank robbery had become a story, a legend, something to be dissected and judged. But for Leo, it wasn't a story. It was a memory etched in the cold pressure of a gun barrel, a memory that ended with a quiet whisper and a gentle push. He heard the men talk about the Thorne Gang, their callousness, their disregard for life. They said the youngest one was a cold-blooded killer. But Leo knew different. He had seen the blue eyes. He had felt the hand. He began to listen. Not to the loud talk of the posse, but to the small, scattered crumbs of information. He heard the blacksmith talk about a worn horseshoe. The store clerk mention a strange, branded rifle. He heard a grizzled, old prospector, back from the hills, mention a camp he'd seen, smoke rising from a place no one ever went. The clues were disparate, a constellation of small details that no one else bothered to connect. They were just pieces of a crime. For Leo, they were a map. His father, in his self-imposed prison of grief, didn't notice. He saw a boy who ate the food that appeared on the table, a boy who mended fences and kept the fire lit. He didn't see the fire in his son's eyes, the quiet purpose that had replaced the boy's lonely resignation. Leo's obsession was a secret, a quiet rebellion against a world that had stolen everything from him. He couldn't save his mother. He couldn't save his father from himself. But maybe, just maybe, he could save the man who saved him. He packed a satchel with jerky and a small pouch of water. He took his father's old hunting rifle, a heavy, familiar weight in his hands. The sun was a pale smear in the eastern sky when he set out, following the trail of the posse, but with a different destination in mind. He knew the land, the secret paths, and hidden gullies. The plains were a vast, empty canvas, but to him, they were a familiar, living map. The wind was his guide, the distant thunder of the posse his compass. He walked for hours, the sun climbing high and hot. The air grew still and heavy. He came across a dry creek bed, its floor a mosaic of cracked clay. In the dust he saw the faint imprint of a horse's hoof, a unique shape he had heard the blacksmith describe. He followed it, his heart pounding a slow, deliberate rhythm. The trail led him away from the main path, into a narrow pass, and then up into the craggy, unforgiving hills. The world grew silent, the only sound the crunch of his boots on loose stone. He saw a wisp of smoke curling up from a rocky outcrop, thin and ghost-like against the blue sky. It was the same smoke the prospector had described. He was close. He climbed a final ridge, the muscles in his legs burning, and looked down. Below him, nestled in a small, hidden bowl in the hills, was a small, crudely built lean-to. A horse was tethered to a scrubby tree. A man sat by a small fire, his back to Leo, staring into the flames. The man's shoulders were slumped, his posture one of utter exhaustion. He wasn't a legend, not a ghost. He was just a man. Leo raised the rifle, his hands shaking. He thought about turning back, about running, about the fear that had been a constant companion. But he didn't. He walked down the steep incline, the stones clattering beneath his feet. The man at the fire didn't move. "I know who you are," Leo said, his voice cracking with nerves. The man turned slowly, his face etched with shadows and fatigue. It was him. The blue eyes, now tired and wary, looked up at Leo, who stood with a rifle pointed directly at him. There was no surprise in them, only a deep, weary resignation. "Well," the man said, his voice a low rumble, "that's a hell of a welcome." The man, Silas Thorne, watched the boy with the old hat and the rifle. He hadn't expected to be found, least of all by a child. He hadn't expected to be found at all. He just wanted a few days of quiet before the inevitable. He'd seen the boy's face 1,000 times since the robbery. The boy was an echo of a life he had lost. "You're the bank boy," Silas said, his voice flat. "Why?" Leo asked, his voice shaking, but his eyes were steady. "Why did you save me?" Silas looked away, staring into the dying fire. The question was a ghost of a memory, a phantom pain. "You had a hat like my boy's," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "He was about your age." He paused, a long, weighted silence hanging in the air. "The fever took him and his mother," he continued, the words coming out as if they were carved from stone. "I was a farmer. A good one, or so I thought. We had a plot of land. I took out a loan, figured I could make a good crop and pay it back. But the rains didn't come. The bank foreclosed. They took everything." His hands, rough and scarred, gripped his knees. "So I took back what was mine. And more. The bank took my boy's future. So I took theirs." His voice was devoid of malice, just a simple statement of fact. He was a man who had been hollowed out by grief, a man whose love had been turned into a weapon. "When that big fool grabbed you, I saw my son. I saw the fear in your eyes, the same fear I saw in his before he went." He finally looked at Leo, the blue eyes filled with a raw, unvarnished pain. "I couldn't let them take another one." The moment stretched on, thick with unspoken grief and shared pain. The boy with no father, the man with a ghost for a son. They were two halves of the same broken whole. Leo lowered the rifle. Silas didn't flinch. The gun wasn't a threat anymore. It was a conversation piece, a symbol of a question answered. "The posse is close," Leo said, his voice now calm and clear. "They're heading this way." Silas nodded. "I know. It was a good run." He looked at the boy, a flicker of something new in his eyes. A spark of life. He'd risked everything for a stranger, and now the stranger had come to him. "You can tell them where I am. You'll be a hero." Leo shook his head, a single, resolute motion. "No, I want to help you." Silas stared at him, a half-smile touching his lips. "Why?" "I'm a bank robber, kid. You shouldn't be here." "Because you're not a killer," Leo said, his words firm and sure. "You saved me. You're not like the others." Silas closed his eyes. The boy was a mirror. He saw the boy he had once been, the man he could have been. He had a choice. He could send the boy away and face his fate alone, or he could accept the help, the grace, of this young stranger. "All right," Silas said, his voice laced with a new, quiet resolve. "We need to get out of here. There's a way, a trail through the canyons. It's hard, but it'll put miles between us and them by morning." Leo, his heart thrumming with a strange sense of purpose, nodded. He was no longer just a witness. He was a participant. He was a partner. The chase was a brutal test of endurance. They moved through the night, the moon a sliver of light against the inky sky. Leo knew the land intimately, every rock, every gully. He led Silas through a maze of narrow passes, their boots crunching on loose gravel, their breath pluming in the cold night air. The sounds of the posse, the distant shouts and the clatter of horses, were a constant nagging presence, but Leo's intimate knowledge of the land was their shield. He knew where the wind would carry their scent, where the terrain would muffle their footsteps. They rested only when they had to, a brief pause for water and jerky before pushing on. Leo watched Silas, the outlaw's face, a mask of weary concentration. He wasn't a monster. He was just a man, running from a ghost. And in helping him run, Leo was running from his own. By dawn, they had reached the far side of the hills. Below them, a vast, flat plain stretched out. A different world, a different future. The sound of the posse was gone, replaced by the chirping of crickets and the low hum of the wind. They had made it. Silas looked at Leo, the blue eyes holding a profound gratitude. "You saved my life," Silas said, his voice thick with emotion. Leo simply nodded. He didn't need the words. He knew. Silas reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn, leather-bound notebook. "This was my son's," he said, his voice soft. "He liked to draw. Animals. Birds." He looked at the row of carved birds in Leo's memory. "He would have liked your work." He pressed the book into Leo's hand. "It's a kind of good luck charm." The gesture was more than a gift. It was an acknowledgement, a passing of a sacred torch. He had seen the artist in the boy, the quiet heart that found beauty in the broken world. "You should go back," Silas said, his voice full of finality. "Your father, he needs you." Leo looked at him. "He's not really there," he said, the words catching in his throat. Silas's eyes softened. He understood. "He's there," he said. "He's just lost in the wilderness. It takes a long time to find your way back. Maybe you can find a way to help him." He paused. "I hope you can." Silas turned and walked down the hill, a solitary figure disappearing into the vastness of the plains. Leo watched him go, the weight of the notebook in his hand, a tangible link to a life, a choice, a journey that had changed everything. He stood there for a long time, watching the sunrise, a new sun, a new day. He walked back to his cabin, the path now a little different. He was no longer a boy running from terror, but a young man walking with purpose. The world was still broken, his father still lost. But Leo had a secret. He knew a truth no one else did. He carried a story in his heart, a story of a boy, a bank robbery, and a kind outlaw. He knew that even in the most desolate of places, a single act of kindness could be a light in the dark. He walked through the door of his cabin, the sun casting long shadows behind him. He looked at his father, a man lost in his own sorrow, and for the first time he felt not just sadness, but a quiet, fierce hope. The wind came in off the plains, no longer a forgotten song, but a whisper of a promise of a new beginning, a path home. If you enjoyed this incredible tale from the frontier, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories from the American West. Click on the video on the screen for another tale we think you will love.